I was in Berlin a while ago, walking through the stark, concrete labyrinth of the Holocaust Memorial. It's impossible not to feel the weight of history there. I overheard a quiet conversation nearby between two tourists, a young German woman and a Japanese man. The German woman was talking about her education, about how the responsibility of remembering is woven into the very fabric of being German. She said something like, "It is ours to carry, always. It's a debt that can never be fully repaid, only remembered." The Japanese man listened intently, nodding. He agreed about the horrors of the past and the need to remember them, but then he said something that made me stop. "I understand that," he said softly, "but my children and their children, they will have nothing to do with that war. They should not have to be born with the burden to apologize." On the surface, it sounded so incredibly reasonable, logical even. Why should generations yet to be born be predestined to carry the shame of their great-grandparents? And yet, that very idea, that simple, rational statement, is seen by Japan's neighbors as a profound insult. It is a sentiment that, far from healing old wounds, is actively creating new ones, fueling a dangerous political firestorm that is now reshaping the future of East Asia. That moment, really, it just captures the heart of our deep dive today. We're exploring this fundamental conflict over historical debt in East Asia. And it's a conflict driven, well, not just by the usual diplomacy and power politics, but by these really deeply rooted cultural differences in how nations even think about shame and honor and atonement itself.
Right. And our mission here is to go beyond just saying, Japan hasn't apologized enough. That's too simple. We need to look at the mechanics underneath the mechanics of memory, of reconciliation that make East Asia, well, quite distinct.
So how are we going to structure this? How do we tackle such a complex issue?
We'll break it down into three main phases. First, we'll dig into the cultural psychology and what's the difference between shame-based and guilt-based ways of dealing with the past. And what is Japan actually trying to achieve when it offers an apology?
Okay, the cultural roots first. Makes sense.
Then second, we'll shift to the present day, more or less. We'll analyze the rise of these ultra-nationalist movements within Japan movements, often fueled by a sense of being maybe bullied by neighbors and pushing a kind of historical revisionism.
Which connects directly back to that initial frustration, right? If apologies aren't accepted.
Exactly. And finally, third, we'll zoom out. We need to put Japan's struggle into a bigger picture, a global context. We'll compare its path with, say, Germany's model of continuous atonement, and also look at something quite different, the Canadian Truth and Reconciliation Commission's approach to internal healing.
Sounds like a comprehensive plan. Let's start with those cultural roots then, phase one.
Okay. So the first thing to grasp is that how nations handle historical trauma isn't universal. It's filtered through deep cultural conditioning. In the West, particularly places influenced by Judeo-Christian traditions, you often find what sociologists sometimes call guilt societies.
Guilt societies, what does that mean exactly?
Well, guilt is primarily an internal feeling, right? It's about recognizing you've done something wrong, transgressed some moral code. The process is often about confession, seeking penance, and carrying that sense of sin until you achieve some kind of redemption. And importantly, this feeling, this obligation, it exists whether anyone else is watching or not.
So it implies this sort of ongoing, maybe permanent internal burden. You have to keep dealing with it.
Precisely. A continuous obligation for historical atonement, often felt very personally.
Okay, let's unpack this. So if that's the guilt model, what about the shame culture model that's often seen as more prevalent in East Asia? How does that change the whole game when it comes to political apologies?
It changes fundamentally. Shame culture is primarily external. It's all about the collective, the group. Shame isn't just feeling bad internally. It's experienced when you fail to meet the group's expectations. It's about losing face, damaging your public standing, your reputation within the community.
So the focus shifts from internal conscience to public perception.
Absolutely. Rigidly focused on public reputation, adhering to social rituals, demonstrating virtue publicly.
Yeah.
And you can trace this idea way back. I mean, it's foundational in East Asian thought. Look at the Analects. Confucius.
What does Confucius say about it?
Well, in Analects 2.3, he draws this really clear distinction. He basically says, if you try to lead people just using laws and punishments, they'll avoid breaking the rules, sure, but they won't develop any real sense of shame.
Compliance without conscience, maybe?
Kind of. But he says, if you lead them with virtue and you regulate society with ritual, with lie, then people will not only develop that crucial sense of shame, but they'll also actively reform themselves. They'll strive to meet the collective standard.
Wow, that passage is really illuminating. So law gets you obedience, but virtue and ritual cultivate this group-centered sense of shame. Okay, if the goal isn't just compliance, but restoring public virtue through ritual, how does that play out politically? What's the goal of an apology in that framework?
It leads to this powerful cultural drive, particularly in Japan, for a sense of closure. You often see it described as a need for definitive purification of the past.
Definitive purification, like wiping the slate clean.
Exactly. From this perspective, when an apology is made, the ritual is performed, the debt is publicly acknowledged, then the public standing should be restored. The matter should be considered settled, purified. It allows the nation, the collective, to move forward without being perpetually burdened. The apology is meant to be a conclusion.
Okay, so when a Japanese prime minister issues a, let's say, sincere apology, the underlying cultural expectation might be, okay, we did the ritual, the account is paid, balance restored, let's close this chapter now.
That seems to be the expectation, yes.
But that crashes head-on into how its neighbors, and perhaps the West too, view historical responsibility, right? This idea of perpetual atonement, or at least ongoing responsibility.
It absolutely does. That desire for definitive purification, for closure, runs directly counter to the view, particularly in Korea and China, that historical obligation is continuous, that the effects linger. So when Japan apologizes and then seems to expect the issue to just vanish,
their neighbors see it differently.
They see that desire for closure not as resolution, but as a kind of moral evasion. Almost like Japan is trying to equate purification with denying any ongoing responsibility or impact.
And it's not like Japan didn't try, especially early on. We can't just say they never apologized. Looking back at the early 1990s, there were some pretty significant formal attempts at accommodation, weren't there?
Oh, absolutely. The early 90s saw some very earnest efforts. You had the landmark Kono Statement in 1993. That was huge. It specifically addressed the horrific issue of sexual slavery, the so-called comfort women.
What did it actually say?
The investigation led to an official acknowledgement that the Japanese military was, whether directly or indirectly, involved in setting up and managing these comfort stations. And crucially, it acknowledged that women were coerced or pressured into service against their will.
That's a major admission.
It was. And then, building on that, you had the Asian Women's Fund, the AWF, established in 1995. Now, technically it was a private fund, but it offered compensation alongside an official letter of apology signed by the prime minister at the time. It expressed remorse.
So, attempts at both acknowledgement and material compensation, even if the structure was debated. And politically, there were direct apologies too, especially toward South Korea.
Yes, very powerful gestures. In 1992, Prime Minister Miyazawa went to the Republic of Korea's National Assembly and delivered what many considered one of the most sweeping apologies. He spoke of the unbearable suffering and grief forced upon the Korean people.
Did he use specific language? Because words matter hugely here.
He did, and this is critical. He used the specific Japanese terms higaisha for Korea, meaning victim, and kagaisha for Japan, meaning perpetrator. That's about as unambiguous as you can get at a high political level, acknowledging Japan as the perpetrator and Korea as the victim.
Okay, so you have the Kono Statement, the Asian Women's Fund, the Miyazawa apology, unequivocal language, acknowledgement of suffering, perpetrator-victim dynamic named. So why didn't it work? Why didn't these acts achieve that purification Japan might have hoped for? Why wasn't the slate wiped clean then?
This is where culture bumps up hard against geopolitics. You have to connect that desire for closure to the harsh reality of the region. It's completely different from post-war Europe. Well, after World War II in Europe, you had the U.S. actively involved in rebuilding trust, fostering cooperation. Germany, though defeated, was quickly positioned as a, quote, responsible partner against the looming Soviet threat. There was an external structure pushing for integration.
And in East Asia?
Nothing comparable.
Yeah.
Regional distrust remained, and arguably remains, exceptionally high. There wasn't that same external push for reconciliation or trust building. Plus, the power dynamics shifted dramatically over time.
Right, Japan's relative position changed.
Hugely. While Japan's been grappling with this history problem for decades, its neighbors, especially China, experienced explosive growth. Since around 2010, China is the largest economy, Japan second. That fundamentally changes the conversation, complicates any attempt at historical dialogue when power balances are shifting so much.
And you also have to factor in how historical narratives are actively used politically in the region, which directly blocks that closure Japan seeks. This brings us to China, right?
It does. You have to consider what's sometimes called the external constraint requirement. After the Tiananmen Square incident in 1989, and with economic reforms challenging the old ideological glue, the Chinese party state needed something to unify the country and bolster loyalty.
And history became that tool.
A primary tool. They launched the patriotic education campaign in the 1990s. This was a deliberate political strategy. Textbooks, museums, films, monuments, they all started emphasizing, often in very explicit and shocking detail, the brutality of the Japanese invasion and occupation. Think Nanjing. Think Unit 731 in Harbin.
So using the trauma of the past to build present-day nationalism and party loyalty.
Precisely. It solidified a national identity built on shared victimhood and the narrative that the Communist Party was and is essential for protecting China from foreign aggression and ensuring national resurgence.
What does that campaign mean for Japan's attempts at purification or closure?
It makes it politically impossible, basically. The party became the gatekeeper, the authoritative narrator of the war history. Any attempt by Japan to say, okay, we've apologized, let's move on, is immediately framed by Beijing and often echoed by Seoul as historical revisionism, as denying the facts, as refusing to accept ongoing responsibility. The external political need to keep the historical grievance alive ensures Japan's cultural desire for purification can never be satisfied through just apologies.
That analysis really sets the stage for the next phase, because if Japan makes what it sees as sincere apologies, performs the rituals, but they're consistently rejected or seen as insufficient, partly due to these geopolitical dynamics, well, that's bound to create immense frustration internally within Japan, isn't it?
Absolutely. Decades of this dynamic apology, rejection, accusation generates profound internal dissatisfaction. And that dissatisfaction hasn't just stayed quiet, it's spilled over dramatically into the political arena. It's fueled the rise of these, what some analysts call action conservative groups.
This feels like a significant shift in Japanese domestic politics. The traditional right wing might have always been there, but this sounds different, more active.
It is different. For a long time, overt nationalism was kind of fringe. But now, you have the undeniable rise of China, the economic and cultural clout of South Korea, the ongoing instability and threat from North Korea. A noticeable segment of the Japanese public perceives all this as a direct threat to the sense of group position.
A threat to Japan's standing in the world and maybe its identity.
Exactly. And that feeling, that perceived threat, reactivates latent nationalism, sometimes prejudice. It feels less like abstract political theory and much more, well, visceral, gut level.
And this visceral reaction is what's creating these new groups like Zaitokukai, which popped up in the early 2010s.
Yes, groups like Zaitokukai are a key example. Their emergence and mobilization seem fundamentally driven by emotion. We're talking about converting people who might have been completely apolitical before into committed right-wing citizens, or uhashimen as they might call themselves.
How does that conversion work? What's the psychological path?
It often starts with short-run emotions, a feeling of shock or fear or anger in response to some perceived slight or threat from abroad, or even from perceived anti-Japan elements within the country. That initial emotional jolt pushes them into action, maybe attending a protest, maybe engaging online.
And the action itself reinforces the feeling.
Precisely. Participation transforms those immediate feelings into a more durable, long-run emotional commitment. It solidifies their identity as activists, and it reinforces the symbolic boundaries, the us versus them. Us, the responsible Japanese citizens defending the nation, versus them, the foreign others, or even the irresponsible Japanese majority who they feel just don't care enough.
Can we look at some specific examples? It helps to see how this plays out in real lives. How does an ordinary person become a dedicated nationalist activist?
Yeah, the research gives us some compelling stories. There's Atsuko, a woman in her 30s working a temp job. She described herself as initially apolitical, maybe vaguely liberal by default. But over years of just watching the news, seeing the diplomatic spats, the perceived rise of neighboring powers, she developed this deep unease, specifically about South Korea.
Just a feeling of discomfort.
A feeling that grew until it demanded action. She started participating in demonstrations, sometimes going straight from her night shift. Her political awakening wasn't about ideology first. It was about responding to that feeling of national threat, feeling she had to physically participate to defend Japan's integrity.
It's interesting that the trigger isn't always complex ideology. Sometimes it's just encountering something radically different, like in the case of Yohei.
Right. Yohei was a man in his 40s, working in mass media. He pinpointed his moment of conversion to watching a video online, some really radical anti-Korean protests. He said the content was just shocking because nobody has ever said something as radical as he, the protest leader, said.
So the shock value itself was the hook.
It seemed so. That confrontation was something taboo, something publicly articulated that felt so extreme, it seemed to bypass his rational filters. It triggered an emotional response, and he actually joined Zaitokukai before he'd even fully processed or agreed with all their specific ideas. The shock propelled him into the group.
That's fascinating. But perhaps the most revealing story, in terms of long-term commitment, is Yukari's experience. It involves transforming personal shame into political resolve through some pretty extreme actions.
Yukari's story is intense. She participated in what the group called telephone assault activities, basically, coordinated campaigns of harassing perceived political opponents or organizations over the phone. She admitted finding this incredibly traumatic initially.
Traumatic for her, the caller.
Yes. She described vomiting from fear and shame when people would hang up on her angrily or condemn what she was doing. But instead of stopping, she felt compelled to push through it. She forced herself to keep making calls, eventually making something like 3,000 calls.
Wow. How did that change her?
By repeatedly confronting and overcoming that intense personal fear and shame through this collective aggressive action, she essentially transformed the trauma. The pain she endured became a justification for the cause itself. It solidified her identity. She wasn't just participating, she was sacrificing, enduring hardship for the nation. It forged a very deep, long-run commitment.
This really highlights their self-perception. They strongly reject labels like racist or far-right. They prefer uhashimin, right-wing citizens, and they don't see their actions as just venting frustration by attacking minorities.
No, not at all in their view. They see themselves as the responsible ones. They often criticize the general Japanese public as being irresponsible and self-centered for ignoring these perceived threats. Their aggression is framed internally as defensive, as necessary patriotism.
And the ultimate justification is often about the future.
Very much so. It's about protecting future generations. Yukari put it explicitly. Her goal was to keep the base of our resistance strong so that her nephews could grow up in a peaceful, secure Japan. Their activism is cast as this deeply moral, almost sacred duty to defend the nation's integrity against both external pressure and internal apathy.
What strikes me here is the echo of that conversation in Berlin. The rationale protecting future generations from carrying the burden of the past sounded reasonable on the surface from that tourist. But when it gets weaponized politically by groups like Zaitokukai, it morphs into historical revisionism, denialism, which is exactly what infuriates Japan's neighbors.
That's the core tension laid bare. And this feeling, this need to defend the group's position, sometimes manifesting as a sense of superiority, it didn't disappear in the 2010s. It has deeper roots.
We need to ground this in that longer history then. This isn't entirely new.
Not at all. You can point to historical moments where this kind of prejudice erupted violently. The horrific massacre of Korean residents in Japan following the 1923 Great Kanto earthquake, fueled by racist rumors and panic that remains a deep scar, showing how quickly prejudice can turn lethal.
A truly dark chapter.
And even looking right after World War II, attitudes were quite stark. A U.S. occupation survey conducted in 1945 found that an astonishing 86% of Japanese respondents felt that Japanese people were superior to the other people of East Asia.
86%, even after defeat.
Even after defeat. That widespread historical sense of group superiority, or at least distinctiveness, provides the psychological bedrock. Modern nationalist movements are essentially building on that existing foundation, reactivating those feelings in their current narrative of resistance against perceived foreign bullying and demands.
Okay, so we've seen the cultural desire for purification clashing with geopolitics, and how that frustration fuels this rise in emotional, action-oriented nationalism internally. Now, let's move to phase 3 and put Japan's path in that comparative global context you mentioned. Germany is the obvious starting point.
Right, Germany and its famous Vergangenheitsbewältigung, the struggle to master or cope with the past. It's the go-to comparison.
But as you hinted, maybe it's not as simple as Germany good, Japan bad. Our sources suggest their starting points after the war weren't actually that different. And we should be careful comparing given, the different goals in the war itself, Japanese expansion versus Nazi annihilation plans.
Absolutely crucial caveats. The aims were different, Pan-Asian co-prosperity sphere versus racial extermination. But if we focus specifically on how they initially handled war crimes politically in the 1950s, the parallels are quite striking.
How so?
Both countries' political elites, in West Germany and Japan, lobbied pretty hard for the release of their imprisoned war criminals. In Germany, there was a very conscious effort to downplay or diffuse Nazi crimes. They used the Cold War context, framing their fight against the Soviets as just a continuation of their earlier anti-Bolshevik crusade.
Trying to normalize the Nazi era.
To an extent. They pushed the totalitarian thesis, equating Nazi and Soviet crimes to minimize the uniqueness of the Holocaust. That persisted well into the 80s. And Germany battled the myth of the clean Wehrmacht, the idea the regular army wasn't involved in atrocities for decades, really only confronting it fully in the 1990s. Some historians argue Japan actually showed more contrition in certain official statements in the 50s than West Germany did at the time.
Okay, so if they started out somewhat similarly, maybe even with Japan being slightly more forward in some respects early on, where did this massive divergence happen? How did Germany end up in what's described as this hyper-contrite mode, while Japan seemed to, as one source put it, keep on limping behind?
The real shift seems to start in the late 1960s in Germany, and then accelerates dramatically after reunification in 1990. It involved key choices by political leaders, but also deep institutional commitments.
Like Willy Brandt kneeling in Warsaw.
That was a hugely powerful symbolic moment in 1970, yes. Spontaneous, personal, seeming to transcend politics. But beyond symbols, after 1990, Germany really institutionalized remembrance. They passed laws making Holocaust denial a crime. They mandated specific curricula in schools. And critically, they invested enormous public funds in creating sites of contrition.
Can you give some examples of these institutional mechanisms? What does that look like on the ground?
Well, just think about Berlin today. The cityscape itself is a testament to this. Right. You have the massive, unavoidable Holocaust memorial right near the Brandenburg Gate. You have the Jewish Museum, the Topography of Terror Museum on the site of the former Gestapo headquarters. These aren't small plaques. They are major state-funded institutions that embed the memory of the crimes into the national identity.
So it's not just apologies, it's baked into the infrastructure, the education.
Exactly. The German state took ownership of the narrative, continuously reinforcing it, ensuring leaders didn't backtrack on apologies. They embraced the idea that this historical debt isn't something you pay off and forget. It's a permanent foundation for present and future moral responsibility. And the result is Berlin filled with these sites of contrition, while Tokyo's memory sites, like Yasukuni Shrine, often, well, greatly irk its neighbors, to put it mildly.
That German model, continuous, institutionalized, externally acknowledged atonement, is one clear path. But now let's pivot, as you suggested, to a very different case. Canada and its Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the TRC, dealing with the legacy of the Indian residential school system. This feels like a different beast, altogether more about internal reckoning within a nation.
It really is a different blueprint. The Canadian TRC offers another way to think about dealing with historical trauma. It's less focused on international relations and more on deep societal transformation through a very structured process of healing within the country. The stated goal wasn't just apology, but moving through awareness, acknowledgement, then atonement, and crucially, action. The ultimate aim, to forge a mutually respectful relationship between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal peoples in Canada.
Before we get into the process, we need to be really clear about the scale of what the TRC was addressing. The residential school system wasn't just a mistake. It was deliberate government policy aimed at something truly devastating.
It was devastating. The commission itself used the term cultural genocide. Over 150,000 First Nations, Inuit, and Métis children were forcibly taken from their families, their communities, and sent to these schools, often far away. The explicit goal, stated horrifically by officials at the time, was to kill the Indian in the child.
What did that mean in practice for the children?
It meant systemic abuse on a massive scale. Physical and sexual assault were rampant. Children were deliberately separated from siblings attending the same school. And maybe most fundamentally damaging, their indigenous languages, the core of their culture and identity, were forbidden. Survivors speak powerfully about the trauma of having their world silenced.
Just horrific. And the schools weren't just sites of cultural destruction, but also places of incredible physical suffering and death.
Tragically, yes. The TRC's research meticulously documented this. Death rates for Indigenous children in these schools were appallingly high, sometimes 5, 6, even 7 times higher than for other Canadian children at the time.
What were they from?
Often rampant diseases like tuberculosis and other lung illnesses, made far worse by the terrible conditions. We're talking about poorly built schools, chronic underfunding leading to inadequate food, children being fed, skimmed milk meant for livestock, and just abysmal sanitation. It was a state-created public health catastrophe for generations of Indigenous children.
So, facing this horrific truth, the TRC recognized that just saying sorry wasn't enough. Atonement had to start with formal truth-telling, right? Documenting the full scope of the harm.
That was absolutely foundational. The commission traveled across Canada, hearing testimony from more than 6,000 witnesses, survivors, their families, former staff. Documenting thousands of individual stories was vital, not just to honor the victims, but to establish an undeniable authoritative truth.
Like building a case almost.
In a way, this process, which drew on indigenous traditions of witnessing, led to concrete outcomes like the National Residential School Student Death Register, trying to identify all the children who died, and the creation of the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, NCTR, to house the records and continue the work. The idea was, without clearly documented truth, you can't have systemic justice.
And a crucial finding of the TRC was that this wasn't just history. The harm didn't end when the last school closed. It continues today, right, through ongoing systemic failures.
Yes. This is maybe the most critical connection the TRC made. They powerfully argued that the legacy of the residential schools is alive and well, manifesting in severe ongoing crises. Two stand out. First, the child welfare crisis.
How is that connected?
The TRC stated bluntly that Canada's modern child welfare system often simply continued the assimilation policies of the schools. The statistics are staggering. In 2011, for example, about 3.6% of all First Nations children under 14 were in foster care. Compare that to just 0.3% of non-Aboriginal children. That's a massive, devastating disparity, directly linked to the breakdown of families and communities caused by the schools.
And the second major ongoing legacy.
The justice system. Again, huge disparities. Aboriginal people in Canada are grossly overrepresented in prisons, both as offenders and as victims of crime. This is directly tied to the intergenerational trauma, the cycles of violence, addiction, and poverty that originated in the abuse and cultural destruction within the schools. Systemic harm created ongoing systemic inequality.
So, if the harm is systemic and ongoing, the solutions proposed by the TRC had to be systemic too. What were some of the key calls to action? What did that action part look like?
The 94 calls to action were incredibly broad, aiming for fundamental change. They targeted key areas. One was education, making it mandatory for all K-12 students in Canada to learn about the history and legacy of residential schools, about the treaties, about the contributions of Indigenous peoples, basically educating the entire country.
Rewriting the national narrative.
Exactly. A second was language. Recognizing Aboriginal language rights is fundamental, and crucially, providing stable long-term funding to help revitalize Indigenous languages, which were deliberately targeted for destruction by the schools. The numbers showed a catastrophic drop, nearly 50% decline in speakers between 1996 and 2011 alone.
And the third area, policy and law.
Yes, and perhaps the most radical. Calls for Canada to formally repudiate colonial legal concepts, like the doctrine of discovery, the old idea that European powers could just claim Indigenous lands, and calls to establish new treaty relationships based on genuine mutual recognition, respect, and resource sharing, moving from a colonial relationship to a nation-to-nation one.
This Canadian model, then, it's built entirely on the idea that reconciliation isn't a single event. It's not one apology, not one settlement payment. It's a process, a very long-term one.
It completely reframes atonement. The TRC basically defined reconciliation as this ongoing national project requiring deep institutional change, shared effort, and something that will take generations. It's not just up to governments either. They stressed it's a shared experience.
How did they describe the path forward, bringing people together?
They spoke about the challenge of finding a way that brings together the legitimate concerns of the people in this room, survivors and Indigenous communities, and the apprehensions, call them fear, that might exist elsewhere in the country. Acknowledging the difficulty, but insisting on the necessity of moving forward together.
So this comprehensive, active, ongoing requirement for institutional change and relationship rebuilding, it really highlights the contrast with that Japanese cultural desire we started with, that hope for a neat, definitive purification through a single ritual act.
The contrast is stark. The Canadian model sees reconciliation as transformation. The German model sees atonement as a permanent state of responsibility. Both stand in opposition to the idea that historical debt can simply be wiped clean and concluded.
And seeing these different global approaches, Germany's institutionalized permanence, Canada's focus on generational transformation, it really helps explain why Japan's situation, caught between its cultural impulse and external pressures, is so incredibly difficult and intractable.
It really does. The Japanese dilemma seems rooted in this mismatch. A deeply held cultural value purification, closure that is fundamentally out of sync with the political realities of its neighborhood, and the nature of deep, enduring historical trauma as understood elsewhere.
So this deep dive, it really lays bare that core tension, doesn't it? When facing the wrongs of the past, there's this fundamental choice. Do you seek a kind of definitive historical acquittal, that desire to apologize once, settle the account, and move on, which seems central to the Japanese dilemma?
Yeah.
Or do you commit to something else? To a continuous act of atonement, maybe involving systemic change, institutional reform, making the memory a permanent part of who you are, like we see in different ways in the German and Canadian examples.
Yeah, that's the heart of it. Japan's cultural preference for closure keeps colliding with the political reality that its neighbors, for their own complex reasons, simply won't grant that closure. So while Germany and Canada, again, in distinct ways, have made dealing with historical debt a seemingly permanent feature of their national identity and policy.
In Japan, you see these nationalist movements fighting fiercely for the exact opposite, the right to erase that debt, especially for future generations.
Exactly.
Which brings us right back full circle to where we started that quiet conversation I overheard at the Holocaust Memorial in Berlin. That choice. Is historical debt a burden to be apologized for once and then hopefully forgotten? Or is it a profound responsibility, one that has to be carried forward actively through tangible actions, through institutional change, generation after generation? How a nation answers that question seems to fundamentally shape its ability to build trust, both with its neighbor and maybe even within itself.